Welcome. My name is Becky Bruce, and I'm the news director at KSL NewsRadio in Salt Lake City, where Cold is based. I'm here with the host of Cold, Dave Cawley, and we're just going to chat about Season 3, Episode 1 today.
Yeah, you got it. Let's get into it.
Ooh, how did you find Heidi Posnine?
Heidi is such an interesting character in the story and just person. So when I first became interested in this case, the Sheree Warren case, and I started talking to some sources and looking through some of the documents that were available, one of the storylines that really popped up was a long time ago, way back in 1971, there was this situation with a guy named Cary Hartmann where he had tried to lure a woman up to this campground in the mountains. And I thought that was terrifying. I wondered, would this woman be willing to tell me her story? I knew from looking at the record that it just resulted in, a minor misdemeanor criminal charge, no, jail time or prison time or anything like that. So it was really kind of a slap on the wrist offense. And I didn't know what this woman would have to say about it. Interestingly enough, I was able to get in touch with her through a former law enforcement contact who was there in the room as we sat down and had this conversation. Heidi is at a stage of her life where I think she, maybe if I had approached her 10 or 20 years ago, wouldn't have wanted to talk about this, but was willing to open up and kind of peel back, I think, some of that trauma from this experience and go through it. And part of what we hear in Season 3, Episode 1 is Heidi telling a little bit about her life story. She is not somebody who I would consider typical in the sense of she's not from Utah where the story takes place. She grew up in, the World War II years in Germany, actually escaped from East Germany after the war and came stateside. And so she just has this really rich kind of personal story to tell that really colors what happens to her at the opening of Cold Season 3, Episode 1.
And I knew going in that this was going to be a story about a woman named Sheree Warren. So it was intriguing to me that you started with somebody else. But I assume that you had a method to that madness.
Yeah, and we tried to address this in the episode a little bit. One of the challenges that we run into with the Sheree Warren case is there's just not that much known about Sheree's life. And in talking to friends and family members, I can glean a little tidbit here or there, but it's really difficult to flesh out a person the way we did with Susan Powell in Cold Season 1, where we had so much of Susan's own writings and, recollections from friends and family members to paint a picture of who she was in life. We don't have that with Sheree. So in opening the story, we have to kind of make a decision about where do we crack the spine on that book. And it just seemed like knowing that this man, Cary Hartmann, would later come in contact with Sheree and would become kind of pivotal in this whole story, maybe we needed to start with kind of his origin and follow that thread through up until he meets Sheree. And that's kind of where we end up in the end of Episode 1.
I'm really intrigued by the idea that Heidi would agree to basically serve as bait for the police. But it sounds like she already had a pretty brave background. She
was super brave. In the episode, she talks about biting a man's nose. She worked in a bar and would be approached by men in kind of unwelcome circumstances. And she talks about, one time she bit a man's nose when he did that. And, she said of Cary Hartmann in this situation where he lured her up to this campground that, she was ready to knock him on his butt if she needed to. That's not to say that she wasn't really nervous and scared. We know Cary Hartmann showed up to this meeting carrying a knife, and he was confronted by 2 undercover deputies. So it was a really scary situation. And Heidi, had a lot of life experience that helped inform her how to do that. But I think even today, if we were to imagine, law enforcement asking a victim to stand into this kind of circumstance, that would be, in my experience, I would be shocked to see something like that happen today.
There's also a really interesting dynamic here where the two families, Heidi's and then Cary Hartmann's family, know each other or knew each other. And so that winds up resulting in kind of less pursuit of justice. So I wonder, in talking with Heidi, does she now regret that?
We had a really good conversation. So what ends up happening is when Cary Hartmann goes to court on this situation with Heidi Posnine, the question is going to be, how hard is Heidi going to push for, the strictest penalty under the law? And the thought was Cary was a young man at this time. He clearly had problems with boundaries. Could his family just get him some help? Let's not ruin this man's life based on this mistake. Now, I think what we see happen is that help doesn't come, and Cary will begin to escalate. In fact, that's the name of this episode, Everything Escalates. And so Heidi later in life, when she learns more about what Cary Hartmann went on to do, does question herself. And she was actually nervous about telling her story for fear that people would, judge that choice that she and her husband made back in 1971 to basically say, look, we're not going to try to throw the book at you as long as you just get some help. It's a complicated thing, I think.
I wonder, though, should that past with Heidi have precluded Cary from being able to get hired as a reserve officer? I mean, that to me feels like kind of the biggest red flag.
How in the world does a guy like Cary Hartmann, who has this criminal conviction, end up carrying a badge and gun for the Ogden Police Department? It's absolutely insane in my mind. And I've actually looked at his application for the Ogden Police Reserve, and you can see he marked in his own hand, yeah, I've had a criminal conviction. I've had, I've stolen from an employer. I've had all these kinds of problems. And that wasn't enough to preclude him serving in the police reserve. Now, all of the brass who were serving in the Ogden Police Department at the time, they're long gone. So I can't ask them, what was it about Cary that led to you giving him this position in the reserve. What I can tell you is Cary was a pretty charismatic guy. He had an ability to make friends, and I think that helped him land this volunteer position for a time as a wannabe police officer.
I mean, it's easy for us to say kind of in hindsight, boy, this guy had some red flags. But it sounds like he may have also had a real ability to kind of get people to trust him.
He did, and I think we see blind spots. Part of what I find very fascinating about this progression and his escalation through the years is even his close friends, when confronted with hard truths about what Cary Hartmann was doing, will continually just fight with themselves over the idea of, could he have done this? Do I believe that he could have done this? And so, yes, in his everyday life, in the women that he dated, in the professional capacities that he had, he was able to pull the wool over a lot of people's eyes. Now, that's not to say that, Cary Hartmann is evil through and through. He's a human being, and we want to make sure that we're not, vilifying somebody. But certainly there were people around him, people in positions of power and authority, even in, the police department, who I think saw him as a fine, upstanding citizen when, in fact, he was doing things that would, at least for me, leave question as to the content of his character.
I've talked to some friends of mine who I will generously say are not Gen X or older, who are really puzzled by how many women engaged with Cary during those lingerie phone calls. And so I think I have perspective as being Gen X or older to be able to say the 80s were a different time, but I wonder if you could speak to that too a little bit.
Yeah, so Cary Hartmann, as we find out through this, run of Cold Season 3, going back to the 70s through the 80s, he was making thousands of phone calls where he would tell women that he was a solicitor or he was doing a survey for a magazine. He wanted to ask them about women's fashion, and they would start going through his list of questions about, do you like to wear, long dresses or skirts? Do you prefer nylons or, going through all these kinds of preferences? And then it would increasingly get invasive and personal to the point where he would be asking about, individual women's bodies, sexuality, things of that nature. And I think the vast majority of women who receive these calls hung up the phone. Many of us today, we get spam calls. They want to ask about our car's extended warranty. We know what it is. We hang up the phone. A small subset of these women that receive the calls would stay on the line and would go through, and each person would have their own kind of break point where that was too much, and then they would hang up. But there were even a tiny fraction of women who would stay through, and then Cary would seal the deal. He would say, let's go get a drink together. And we know of at least a couple scenarios where that was a successful strategy for him to meet women. I'm not a psychologist. I can't tell you what about each of these individual people led them to make those choices. But it is a fascinating thing. I think many of us today are more on guard. That being said, that behavior of non-consensual sexual kind of phone calls, I think has evolved, and we see unsolicited pics and stuff like that on dating apps kind of taking the place. So the 80s were a different time, but that behavior has not gone away.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess what I was getting at is if you've ever seen like the movie 9 to 5, Dolly Parton puts up with a lot of flack from her boss that like today we would just be like, oh, that's a sexual harassment lawsuit waiting to happen. And I feel like there was a lot of pressure on women in particular in the 80s to just kind of play nice and be polite and not be rude, right? And so, yes, hanging up the phone was an option, but you might have to get like really over the line before you'd feel comfortable being like, slam, I'm not talking to you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like it's obvious to us in hindsight, but you also have to kind of keep that in mind that it really was a different era and we've learned a lot. But you're right. It's not that behavior has gone away. It's just shifted.
And part of the value, in my view, of telling a story like this Sheree Warren case and then expanding it out a little bit to look at some of this, other behavior that plays in is that it allows us to see it from the outside and recognize and call it what it is, right? That this was a form of abuse. It's non-consensual, sexual activity. It's not physically assaultive the way, a hands-on sexual assault would be, but that doesn't mean that it's any less wrong. And we should recognize it as such and call it such.
Obviously, there's a lot more for us to talk about. Those will come in a different video. But first, where can people find Season 3 of Cold?
Yeah, Cold Season 3, available now anywhere you get your podcasts. Also highly recommend if you want to binge all episodes, you can get those on Amazon Music.